No one in the room expected the governor to unravel like this. One moment, Sarah Huckabee Sanders was posturing with the same measured smirk she'd perfected behind podiums and cameras for years. The next, her voice cracked with sharpness, her tone fraying at the edges as she snapped back at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The words spilled out fast, defensive, as if the weight of the question had pierced straight through her armor. Chapter 4 Friday. Chamber froze. Reporters lowered their pens mid-scribble. Photographers, already firing in bursts, doubled down, their flashes exploding like fireworks against Sanders's reddening face. A silence hung heavy in the air, punctured only by the staccato clicks of cameras and the faint shuffling of papers from aides, who suddenly seemed very small in their chairs. Sanders' hands clenched the table. She leaned forward, her voice rising, laced with indignation. "How dare you? How dare you question my integrity?" The words rang out, echoing in the room like a gavel strike, but they landed differently than she intended. Instead of command, it sounded like desperation. Instead of strength, it smelled of fear. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked, unshaken, the calm of someone who had walked through storms far greater than one governor's fragile temper. She didn't even need to respond yet. Her silence was the rebuttal, her stillness the counterpunch. The contrast could not have been sharper. Sanders flailing under the spotlight, Crockett steady in the storm. The room seemed to lean toward Crockett, waiting for her move, like an audience waiting for the hero's line in a movie's pivotal scene. Even the reporters, who had seen every scandal and every spin cycle before, sensed they were watching something different, something raw, something unforgettable. The governor's voice cracked again as she tried to reclaim control. "You think you can stand there and lecture me?" It was less a statement than a plea, the cry of someone cornered not by her opponent, but by her own contradictions. And every flash of every camera was sealing the moment into history, an image destined to travel farther than Sanders could ever run from it. But the moment that triggered Sanders' meltdown, that would come from a single, devastating question. The outburst was not just a slip of the tongue, not just a bad moment under pressure. It cut to the very heart of why this confrontation mattered. Sarah Huckabee Sanders had built her career on an image of iron discipline and moral certainty, a political brand polished and packaged for conservative America. The dutiful daughter, the defender of family values, the self-proclaimed voice of Christian leadership. She had sold herself as the heir to tradition, the one who could stand firm when others wavered. But in that room, in that single crack of her voice, the illusion trembled. Because when a leader who preaches strength collapses at the first sign of truth, it isn't just embarrassing, it's revealing. It shows the fragility beneath the slogans, the hypocrisy hidden behind the scripture-laced soundbites. Sanders' entire persona was built on the claim that she could not be rattled, that her values made her unshakable. And yet, here she was, rattled to her core by a question that hadn't even fully landed. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congresswoman whose rise had already been marked by fire and fearlessness. Crockett's reputation was growing. A sharp cross-examiner, a woman unafraid to say what others whispered, unafraid to stare down power with unblinking eyes. Where others circled politely around hypocrisy, Crockett charged straight through it. She was not there to trade, rehearsed lines, or bask in polite applause. She was there to expose, to confront, to drag hidden truths into the light. The contrast between them could not have been more electric. Sanders, cloaked in the mantle of piety and tradition, holding tight to talking points that played well on Conservative airwaves. Crockett, unapologetic, carrying the grit of her community and the sharpness of a trial lawyer who had spent years dismantling evasions piece by piece. And this mattered for more than just political theater. It mattered because accountability in America had become a rarity, especially for those shielded by privilege and power. Sanders represented not just a governor, but a dynasty of deflection, a name built on spinning narratives, stretching truth until it broke, and cloaking it all in faith and patriotism. Crockett represented a new guard, unwilling to bow, unwilling to let hypocrisy masquerade as leadership. Every person in that room sensed it. The reporters scribbling in their notepads weren't just recording quotes. They were chronicling a collision of eras. The aides clutching their binders weren't just nervous about the day's headlines. They could feel history's weight pressing on the chamber walls. And beyond the room, millions would soon see in this exchange something that transcended one governor, one congresswoman, or even one state. They would see the eternal clash between truth and spin, dignity and arrogance, courage and cowardice. The stakes stretched far beyond Sanders's fragile composure. They reached into the question of what kind of leadership America would tolerate, and what kind it would reject. Would power continue to hide behind rehearsed outrage and sanctimonious branding? Or would courage, even from those newer to the national stage, finally puncture the armor of hypocrisy? In that room, in that instant, you could feel the answer forming. Because Crockett hadn't yet spoken her sharpest line, hadn't yet delivered. The strike that would echo on social media feeds and in living rooms across the country. The air was still holding its breath, waiting for the words that would set the nation ablaze. What happened next would ripple far beyond this room, across the entire nation. To understand why Sarah Huckabee Sanders' meltdown carried such weight, one must look at the story she had crafted for herself, and the cracks that had long been forming beneath it. For years, Sanders presented herself as the unflinching warrior of conservative politics, the steady hand who could dish out tough talk with the same ease as her father once did from pulpits and podiums. She was cast as both heir and innovator, the embodiment of family values wrapped in the armor of Christian leadership. Her image was sculpted around strength, the governor who would not bow, the spokeswoman who never blinked, the woman who could spar with the press corps and come out smiling. But behind the performance lay a deeper fragility, one that surfaced whenever her talking points faced real scrutiny. For all her bluster, Sanders had always shown herself less comfortable when stripped of a script. Take her record on transparency. She preached openness and honesty, branding herself as the antidote to so-called corrupt elites. Yet in Arkansas, her administration had gone out of its way to shield travel records from the public, claiming security concerns while critics pointed to political convenience. The same governor who spoke about serving the people kept the people in the dark about who was funding her trips and shaping her agenda. When pressed, she brushed off questions with the sharpness of someone more concerned with control than clarity, or consider her posture on morality. Sanders routinely invoked the Bible, positioning herself as a defender of Christian virtue. She talked of humility, sacrifice, and faith as though they were her guiding lights. But humility was absent in her politics. She turned compassion into performance art, celebrating herself for signing restrictive policies that harmed the very working families she claimed to champion. Her so-called virtue became a cloak, covering arrogance with scripture, draping ambition with the language of service. Even during her time as White House press secretary, Sanders became infamous for her evasions. The tough talker image played well to a base hungry for defiance, but it was built on a foundation of deflection. She spun falsehoods without hesitation, defended the indefensible with a calm smile, and dismissed truth as bias. She didn't answer questions. She bulldozed them. Her toughness was not the resilience of a leader, but the rigidity of someone terrified of admitting weakness. And that was the contradiction now bleeding into the present moment. For years, Sanders had survived by controlling the stage. Press conferences she could end at will. Rallies filled with loyalists. Interviews framed to flatter. But a confrontation like this one, raw, unfiltered, and in front of cameras, she couldn't control, stripped away her safety nets. The strong leader facade began to wobble, revealing the defensiveness beneath. Arrogance had always been her shield. When cornered, she leaned harder into indignation, presenting herself as the victim of unfair attacks. She thrived on the applause of those who saw every question as an insult, every request for accountability as persecution. It was a formula that worked for years. Paint herself as righteous, paint critics as enemies, and let the faithful rally to her defense. But arrogance is a brittle armor. It gleams bright under stage lights, yet shatters under the hammer of truth. What made this moment with Jasmine Crockett so dangerous for Sanders was that it was not just another reporter asking for clarification, not another pundit raising an eyebrow. It was a congresswoman, sharp and unyielding, with a platform of her own and an audience eager for authenticity. Sanders' old tactics, dismiss, deflect, play the victim, risked collapse when deployed against someone who did not flinch, who would not be silenced by posturing. The irony was striking. Sanders, who had built her identity on toughness, was suddenly the one losing composure. She, who had preached virtue, found herself unable to model it under pressure. She, who had claimed moral clarity, revealed only defensiveness and anger. The hypocrisy was not theoretical anymore. It was alive in real time, unfolding before the cameras. The press in the room recognized it instantly. They had chronicled Sanders's career long enough to know the pattern: big claims, shaky truths, deflective answers. But never had the contradiction been so exposed, so undeniable. Never had the mask slipped so suddenly, with so many witnesses. It was the arrogance cloaked as virtue that made her downfall so captivating. Watching Sanders rage while insisting on her integrity wasn't just political theater. It was the unraveling of a persona she had sold for years. And for the millions who would later watch, the message was clear. The tough talker wasn't so tough after all. But on this day, Sanders would finally meet someone unafraid to call her out. Live, in front of millions. Before Jasmine Crockett ever stepped foot into the halls of Congress, before her words sent shock waves through a chamber and rattled a governor to her core, she was a daughter of working-class grit. Her story began far from the spotlight, in a home that did not promise privilege, but did instill persistence. Crockett grew up with parents who believed in dignity, in putting in the work even when the odds were stacked against you, and in standing tall no matter how many times the world tried to knock you down. It was in that environment that Crockett's fire was forged. She learned early that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that waiting for someone else to step up often meant waiting forever. As a student, she was the one unafraid to challenge unfair treatment, to speak when others whispered. That instinct to confront power, to stand where others hesitated, would become the through line of her life. Her path into law was not one paved with shortcuts or the safety nets that cushion the privileged. Crockett fought her way through, juggling jobs, navigating the kind of financial and social obstacles that weed out the less determined. But instead of breaking her, those struggles became her foundation. By the time she took her place as a public defender, she carried into the courtroom not only legal training, but the lived experience of the very people she defended. She knew what it meant to stand on the margins, and she carried that understanding like a sword. Crockett's years as a lawyer sharpened her edge. In cramped courtrooms, often underfunded and overlooked, she saw firsthand how power twisted rules against the powerless. She cross-examined police officers who cut corners, prosecutors who overreached, and systems that treated poverty like a crime. Time after time, she refused to bend to intimidation. Every case was another reminder. If you want justice, you must be willing to fight for it. And fight she did, with a sharpness that earned both respect and resentment. When Crockett entered politics, she did not soften that edge to fit neatly into the mold. She brought it with her, unapologetically. Her campaigns spoke not to corporate donors or old power brokers, but to everyday people who saw in her someone unafraid to say what others tiptoed around. She framed herself as the defender of communities, long ignored, the voice of the working poor, the advocate for those who never got a seat at the table. That boldness quickly became her signature. In legislative battles, Crockett was the one willing to press, to dig, to hold her ground. She didn't cloak her critiques in politeness when truth was at stake. Critics called her fiery, brash, even too aggressive. Supporters called her fearless. To her, the labels didn't matter. What mattered was the fight, the refusal to let hypocrisy skate by unchallenged. And that is what made her such a perfect counterforce to Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Crockett's story was not about carefully curated images or scripted branding. It was about scars, survival, and strength earned the hard way. Where Sanders leaned on family legacy, Crockett leaned on hard-fought battles. Where Sanders wrapped herself in the language of virtue while dodging accountability, Crockett's entire identity was rooted in accountability, in dragging hidden truths into the open. Her rise in Congress was not meteoric in the sense of headlines alone. It was meteoric in the sense of impact. Within her first months, clips of Crockett went viral across social media. Her sharp questioning cutting through evasions, her quick wit dismantling talking points, her refusal to shrink in the face of powerful men who tried to wave her off. Each moment resonated because it was authentic, uncoached, and raw. Millions of Americans saw in her a reflection of their own frustrations, someone finally saying what they wished they could say to leaders who lied, dodged, and postured. Yet behind that sharpness was something deeper, an unshakable calm. Crockett did not need to raise her voice to prove her power. She carried herself with the steadiness of someone who had endured storms far fiercer than political sparring. Her presence itself was disarming, her confidence radiating not from arrogance, but from conviction. That conviction mattered, because Crockett did not just see politics as policy. She saw it as personal. Every attack on immigrants, every assault on voting rights, every attempt to roll back protections for marginalized communities was not abstract. It was an attack on people she knew, families like hers, neighbors she had grown up with. She carried those stories with her, and they shaped the way she spoke, the way she confronted hypocrisy, the way she refused to let arrogance go unchecked. So when she entered that room with Sanders, Crockett was not walking in alone. She carried the weight of her journey, the lessons of her upbringing, the scars of her legal battles, and the voices of the people who had put their faith in her. She carried the stories of the working poor, the overlooked, the disrespected. She carried the urgency of immigrants striving for dignity, the resilience of communities dismissed by the powerful, and the strength of generations told to stay quiet. And that was the heart of her power. Sanders's brand was performance. Crockett's brand was lived truth. Sanders cloaked arrogance in virtue. Crockett wielded virtue as a weapon against arrogance. One projected toughness, but crumbled when challenged. The other carried toughness, because she had lived it, breathed it, survived it. And so, when their paths collided, Crockett carried not just her own voice, but the voice of countless Americans. The air in the chamber was already charged from Sanders' initial outburst, but what followed turned a tense exchange into a full-blown clash. Sanders tried to recover her footing by lashing out, tossing barbed remarks in Crockett's direction, hoping that aggression would mask her unraveling composure. "Congresswoman, maybe if you focused less on theatrics and more on governing, you'd understand what real leadership looks like," she snapped, her words aimed to sting, her voice dripping with condescension. But Crockett didn't bite. She leaned in slightly, her expression calm, almost surgical, as though dissecting Sanders's rhetoric piece by piece. "Governor," she replied, voice even, tone precise. "Leadership begins with honesty. Let's start there." The chamber stirred. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but the precision cut deeper than any raised voice could. Sanders' face tightened. She attempted to pivot, to redirect attention away from the question at hand. She launched into a well-rehearsed litany about protecting families, about preserving faith in public institutions, about the dangers of radical leftists. It was her comfort zone, the familiar refuge of slogans and sound bites. But Crockett didn't let her escape. "Respectfully, Governor," Crockett interrupted, her tone still steady. "No one asked for a speech. I asked for accountability, and that's what the people deserve." The words landed with weight. Sanders tried to cut in, speaking over her. "I am accountable. I've delivered more for Arkansas than—" But her voice wavered, the conviction faltering under Crockett's unwavering gaze. Every dodge was met with another question, every evasion pinned back to the wall. The back and forth quickened, the contrast sharpening with each exchange. Sanders spoke faster, more defensively, her hands gesturing in frustration, her voice rising as though sheer volume might win the argument. Crockett, by contrast, slowed down. Each word from her carried intention, each phrase measured, unshaken. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the rhythm of the duel. Flashes burst as photographers leaned forward, trying to catch Sanders mid-interruption, Crockett mid-glare. Aides shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves, sensing the imbalance. Sanders was supposed to be the unflappable veteran, the steady force in the room. Instead, she looked like someone cornered, scrambling for escape routes that no longer existed. Sanders resorted to pot shots, each one more desperate than the last. "This congresswoman is just trying to make a name for herself," she sneered. "This is about headlines, not truth." But Crockett didn't blink. "If the truth creates headlines," she replied coolly, "maybe it's because people are tired of hypocrisy." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Even those long accustomed to political brawls could feel the temperature rising. With every exchange, Crockett sharpened her focus, like a blade honing itself against resistance. Sanders, on the other hand, dulled her own credibility with every deflection. The louder she grew, the smaller she appeared. And with each calm, incisive question Crockett posed, the governor's composure chipped away. Sanders tried once more to drown the moment in indignation. "I will not be lectured by someone who—" she began, voice strained, hand slamming the desk for emphasis. But the slam echoed like desperation, not authority. Crockett let the silence linger for half a beat before responding, her tone lower, steadier, cutting through the noise with chilling clarity. Governor, you don't have to be lectured. You just have to answer the question. That was the moment the room shifted. The balance of power tilted visibly, the roles of aggressor and defender no longer clear. Sanders was rattled, fumbling, while Crockett grew sharper, her control absolute. The governor's pot shots only amplified her own weakness, while Crockett's restraint magnified her strength. The audience, both in the chamber and the millions soon to watch, could feel it in their bones. This wasn't just a debate. It was the slow unraveling of an image that had been carefully manufactured for years. Sanders, the self-proclaimed tough talker, was losing to a calm, unflinching adversary who refused to play by the old rules of power. And just as Sanders tried to regroup, just as she reached for yet another talking point to shield herself, Crockett prepared to deliver the blow that would strip away the last of the governor's defenses. But then came the moment that no spin, no slogan, no talking point could save. The chamber was already vibrating with tension when Jasmine Crockett finally leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Sanders like a surgeon ready to make the final incision. She had been patient, deliberate, allowing Sanders to swing and miss with deflections and pot shots. Now, with the governor rattled and the room hanging on every syllable, Crockett delivered the line that would shatter the facade. "Governor," she began, her tone calm but edged with unmistakable gravity. "You talk about integrity, about family values, about faith. But integrity isn't hiding your travel records from the very people you serve. Family values aren't cutting funding for families who can't put food on the table. And faith isn't a shield you use to dodge accountability." Santihu, words landed like a thunderclap. Sanders blinked hard, her lips parting as though to fire back, but no words came. A hush blanketed the room. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Even the rapid-fire bursts of camera shutters seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if the cameras themselves were stunned by the precision of the strike. Crockett let the silence stretch. It was a weapon in itself, magnifying the weight of what she had just said. Every second without a reply turned the statement from accusation into undeniable truth. Sanders shifted in her seat, her hand brushing a stack of papers as if the answers she needed might somehow be written there. Then Crockett pressed further. Her voice lowered, forcing the room to lean in. "You want to lecture America on virtue, while your record shows hypocrisy. You want to call yourself a leader, while you run from questions. Governor, that's not leadership. That's cowardice dressed up as conviction." A ripple moved through the chamber. Gasps from a few corners, sharp intakes of breath from aides, who couldn't mask their disbelief. Someone coughed nervously. A few heads turned, eyes darting between Crockett's composure and Sanders' unraveling face. Sanders tried to respond. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again, her voice breaking. That's not true, But the words stumbled out uneven, stripped of the force she once commanded. She gestured weakly with her hands, as if motion could substitute for clarity. "I have always stood for families. I've always—" Her sentence collapsed under its own weight. Crockett didn't interrupt. She simply watched, her silence saying more than any rebuttal could. And in that silence, Sanders's credibility crumbled. The governor, who once barked confidently at the White House press corps, now looked like someone cornered in her own contradictions, exposed for all to see. The cameras zoomed closer. You could almost hear the clicking lenses adjusting, trying to capture the exact moment Sanders's mask slipped. The governor's eyes darted, her jaw tightened, her voice shrank to defensiveness. The contrast was cinematic. One woman steady, commanding with stillness. The other unraveling, desperate for an escape. And though the chamber remained formally quiet, there was an energy pulsing from it that felt louder than any applause. It was in the glances exchanged between journalists, in the barely audible whispers of "wow" from the gallery, in the sudden stiffening of aides who knew the headline was already written. The audience watching through television screens and live streams would later provide the roar, the tweets, the memes, the hashtags. But in this moment, you could feel the spirit of that reaction already forming in the silence. Sanders tried. Again, her voice now tinged with panic. This is just another attack. Another example of the left, twisting my words, twisting my record. The people of Arkansas know me. They know my values. They know. Do they? Crockett interjected, her tone still level, still unhurried. The two words hung in the air, devastating in their simplicity. Sanders stopped mid-sentence, the momentum cut from her like air sucked out of a balloon. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Sanders, because what they're seeing right now isn't strength. It's fear. That was the breaking point. You could see it in Sanders's face, the flush of anger mixed with humiliation, the tightening of her jaw, the frantic blinking. She muttered something about partisan grandstanding, but the words fell flat, unconvincing, like a script no one in the room was buying anymore. Crockett didn't need to say anything further. She had delivered the blow, and now the silence did the rest. The governor, once so skilled at turning offense into applause lines, found herself stripped of armor, her every deflection only digging the hole deeper. And in that moment, Sanders wasn't just losing an argument, she was losing her image. The self-proclaimed defender of values had been exposed as someone hiding behind them. The tough talker had been reduced to stammers. The leader had been revealed as fragile. The chamber seemed to exhale all at once. Some scribes leaned back in their chairs, shaking their heads. Others kept writing furiously, knowing they had just witnessed the kind of exchange that would dominate news cycles. But all of them felt the same shift. The realization that Jasmine Crockett had just dismantled Sarah Huckabee Sanders in real time, and there was no recovering from it. Crockett leaned back again, her hands folding neatly, her eyes still fixed on Sanders, but her expression softening into something almost pitying. She didn't gloat, didn't grin, didn't revel in the takedown. She didn't need to. The truth was loud enough on its own. For Sanders, the silence afterward was deafening. Every second without a convincing response became a judgment, every fumbling word an indictment. She tried to adjust her papers again, tried to sip from her glass of water, tried to steady her hands, but the cameras captured it all. The governor, who once controlled rooms with rehearsed authority, was now just another politician exposed, her hypocrisy laid bare by someone who refused to let her escape. The moment felt final, like a gavel strike echoing through history. Crockett had spoken for more than herself. She had spoken for every voter tired of spin, every immigrant tired of being scapegoated, every working parent tired of hearing about family values while struggling to feed their family. Her words carried all of them into the chamber, amplifying the silence that followed, and Sanders knew it. That was why she fumbled, why her voice cracked, why she leaned so hard on lines that no longer protected her. She had been stripped bare, and no slogan, no deflection, no familiar trick could shield her anymore. The chamber would move on. The hearing would eventually conclude, and aides would rush to spin the story. But nothing could erase the moment. The still frame of Sanders caught in fragility, while Crockett's words lingered in the air like a verdict. But outside those walls, the real explosion was only beginning. The chamber may have emptied, but the echo of that moment carried far beyond its walls. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown spread like wildfire across social media. A shaky cell phone recording surfaced first, posted by an aide who couldn't resist capturing history. Then came the polished feeds, news outlets uploading the clean footage, hashtags sprouting in real time. Gunner Crockett clapped back. Sanders exposed. Chutritwe, fear is not leadership. Twitter timelines flooded with looping gifs of Sanders's stammer, side by side with Crockett's piercing calm. Memes multiplied by the hour. Sanders fumbling with her papers photoshopped into a house of cards collapsing. Crockett's two-word question, "Do they?" emblazoned across bold graphics like a rallying cry. TikTok creators spliced Crockett's words with booming soundtracks, their videos hitting millions of views before the day was done. Cable networks seized on the drama. Primetime hosts played the exchange on repeat, each frame scrutinized, each pause dissected. Commentators spoke of it not as a debate, but as a defining moment, a collision between truth and performance. Even the late-night comedians jumped in. One quipped, "Sarah Sanders wanted transparency. Turns out she's just transparent when she's nervous." The punchlines landed, but the underlying message remained sharp. Sanders had been publicly unmasked. Political rivals smelled blood. Opponents in Arkansas rushed to the microphones, painting the governor as weak, evasive, untrustworthy. National figures joined in, using Crockett's words as ammunition in speeches and interviews. "This is what happens," one senator declared, "when leaders think slogans can hide the truth." Jasmine Crockett showed us the difference between spin and spine. But what mattered most wasn't the politicians or the pundits. It was the people. Today, comments sections, on Facebook pages, in WhatsApp group chats and Instagram stories, ordinary Americans were amplifying the moment. Immigrants shared Crockett's words like a badge of honor. Working parents reposted clips, writing, "Finally, someone said it." Activists used the momentum to rally donations and organize meetings. For them, Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a vessel of validation, proof that truth could still pierce through power. The ripple effect was undeniable. Hashtags turned into trending topics turned into segments on morning shows, and by the end of the week, Crockett's name recognition had soared. Polling firms even began asking about her favorability. One analyst noted, "This was lightning in a bottle." Crockett didn't just challenge Sanders. She embodied a growing frustration with hypocrisy, and people recognized themselves in her words. Sanders, meanwhile, faced a different tide. Clips of her fumbling replayed, endlessly, overshadowing her attempts at damage control. Press releases fell flat, her defenses sounding hollow against the stark clarity of the video evidence. Each interview became an exercise in avoidance, each statement further proof of the fragility Crockett had exposed. And through it all, Crockett never boasted. She didn't need to. Her silence after the exchange became its own kind of statement, reinforcing the sense that she had spoken not for herself, but for millions who rarely get the microphone. The public read that restraint as strength, as dignity, a quality that elevated her above the mud-slinging world of politics. Grassroots organizers harnessed the energy. Petitions circulated. Fundraising pages lit up. Volunteers offered their time, their voices, their creativity to amplify the message. A sense of momentum, rare and electric, began to form. not just for Crockett, but for a broader movement that framed integrity as resistance and resistance as patriotism. The moment became more than just a headline, it became a touchstone. For weeks, Sanders's name was paired not with policy, but with her unraveling. And Crockett's became shorthand for courage in the face of power. And yet, beyond the headlines, a deeper lesson was taking shape. In the days that followed, it became clear this clash wasn't just about two politicians sparring under bright lights. It was about something deeper, something woven into the fabric of America's promise. Jasmine Crockett's moment reminded the nation that dignity speaks louder than hypocrisy, that truth resonates longer than slogans, and that courage is the language people still crave from their leaders. Sarah Huckabee Sanders had built her brand on polished lines about faith, family, and values. But when pressed, the facade cracked. What America saw in that instant wasn't leadership. It was insecurity. And yet, on the other side of the table, what they saw in Crockett was authenticity. Not perfection, not spin, but a voice unafraid to stand firm. That contrast mattered. It echoed because it revealed a simple truth. When hypocrisy is unmasked, dignity will always shine brighter. For many, this wasn't just a political scuffle. It was a mirror. Immigrant families saw in Crockett the courage they teach their children when they say, "Never let anyone silence you." Working-class Americans recognize the grit of someone who speaks plainly, directly, without hiding behind consultants or buzzwords. Women, in particular, felt the sting and the triumph, the sting of watching yet another powerful figure unravel defensively, and the triumph of seeing a woman of color meet that unraveling with unshaken poise. Moral was unmistakable. Truth-telling is not only resistance, it is patriotism. At a time when so much of politics feels like a theater of masks and rehearsed lines, Crockett demonstrated that authenticity can pierce through the noise. She reminded us that democracy doesn't demand perfection, but it does demand honesty. And in standing tall, she validated the quiet strength of millions who rarely get the microphone but carry the nation's backbone in their labor, their dreams, and their resilience. What Sanders represented in that moment wasn't merely one governor's hypocrisy. It was the larger sickness of power that cloaks itself in virtue while hiding contradictions in the shadows. And what Crockett offered was the antidote, not through grandstanding, but through a clear, simple insistence on accountability. Her calm became revolutionary precisely because it showed that dignity itself is a form of defiance. And so the story transcended politics. It became a parable of American values, that the measure of leadership is not in how loud one shouts, but in how firmly one stands when tested. Crockett's courage lit a spark, not because she sought the spotlight, but because she carried voices into it. Voices often dismissed, voices too often unheard. For the audience, the takeaway was personal. This wasn't a call to admire someone else's bravery from afar. It was a reminder that courage belongs to all of us, that each person holds the capacity to stand up when power overreaches, to question when authority demands silence, to embody dignity in the face of hypocrisy. That, too, is patriotism. That, too, is America. And so, as the dust settled, one lesson remained carved into the story. Leadership crumbles without truth, but dignity endures. Sanders' outburst will be remembered as a collapse. Crockett's calm will be remembered as a beacon. And for everyone who watched, the challenge lingers still. When the moment comes, when the cameras are rolling or the silence feels heavy, will we shrink back into fear? Or will we, Like Jasmine Crockett, rise with courage in the face of power. Sarah Huckabee Sanders lost her composure. Jasmine Crockett exposed her hypocrisy. That is the heart of this story, and the reason it struck such a chord across the country. When arrogance meets accountability, when hollow slogans crash against the wall of truth, only one thing can happen. The mask shatters. And when it did, Crockett showed us what dignity in action truly looks like. This wasn't just a headline or a trending clip. It was a reminder that in the theater of politics, arrogance may take center stage for a moment, but it cannot hold the spotlight forever. Dignity endures. Courage endures. And the people, watching, listening, demanding better, are the true arbiters of justice. So if this moment moved you, if it reminded you why truth matters and why accountability can never be optional, then don't just watch. Be part of the echo. Share this story. Subscribe for more. Join a community that refuses to stay silent when hypocrisy tries to drown out honesty. Because every voice raised against spin, every hand that lifts the signal higher, keeps the fight for truth alive. We are living in a time when spin is everywhere, but so is courage. And together, we can make sure the courageous voices are the ones that rise, resonate, and reverberate far beyond any single chamber or headline. Because in the end, justice always echoes louder than hypocrisy.